Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with my colleagues Alicia Finley and Joe Sternberg. Let's talk about this new Congressional House Committee. Chairman is Michael Gallagher of Wisconsin, and the ranking member, Raja Krishnamurti of Illinois. And they're working very well together so far on this committee. Going to make this, to the extent that Chairman Gallagher says he can, a bipartisan endeavor trying to explore the many elements of U.S.-China competition. And let's listen to Chairman Gallagher at the opening hearing.
We must learn from our mistakes. For much of the past half century, we tried to win the CCP over with honey, with engagement, believing that economic engagement in particular would lead to reforms in China. Both parties made the same bet. The only problem is it didn't work out. We were wrong. The CCP laughed at our naivety while they took advantage of our good faith. But that era of wishful thinking is over.
Joe, is this committee a good idea? And I ask that in the context that there's no shortage of committees dealing with foreign affairs and defense and other competition issues. Do we need another one?
Well, I mean, my sense, at least having watched the first hearing, is that this committee at least has the virtue of being serious, which is not something that you always take for granted on Capitol Hill. I think that they accomplish a couple of things in their first session, and if they can keep going on these strands, it'll end up being pretty productive. One is that they came out swinging on the issue of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, the fact that it does have a very particular ideological organization. It has not scrubbed itself of the communism part or the Marxist part. That is definitely its worldview. And I think that this is a point that we have often wanted to overlook in the West, particularly as we were pursuing commercial engagement. So just from if you want to use the phrase know your enemy or know your strategic competitor, that's a useful exercise. And I think that the other thing that I found useful listening to this compared to so much of the other discussion about China that tends to go on is that they were very careful about drawing a bright distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. And I think that it is important to understand that the source of this tension and rivalry is the nature of the Communist Party regime. It is not animus directed at China as a country. And so I think that the more that the U.S. can be clear on that issue, it will help, would hope, shape some of these discussions in a very positive, useful direction moving forward.
An important point, Joe. The Communist Party of China has something like 90 million members, so it's not a small group, but it's that 90 million who then rule the 1.4 billion. So they control the levers of power. And understanding that distinction is absolutely crucial and probably a good idea to have a congressional committee that zeroes in on China. I give both Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, and Mike Gallagher credit for directing this in a bipartisan fashion. It will have that much more, I think, potential impact and credibility as it pursues this in a bipartisan way. And the ranking member, Mr. Krishnamurti, has so far seconded these intentions, and I think it's very useful. And China, Alicia, is an issue that has emerged as one in American politics that does have bipartisan support. That is the recognition of the China challenge, the recognition of the potential military threat it poses, and the focus on Chinese Communist Party behavior, not only with its own people, but in the United States, in the degree to which it attempts to influence U.S. public opinion and punish Chinese national dissenters who happen to live on U.S. soil.
I think that's right. I think there's been a lot of interest among both parties investigating these Confucius Institutes that are present on a lot of college campuses, as well as you're seeing more investigations. You saw this both in the Trump administration and the Biden administration of researchers at universities and whether there have been allegations and there have been charges against some for IP theft. Basically, they're taking IP and sharing it with Chinese companies or actually the Chinese government. So again, I think that's a bipartisan interest. You've seen a lot of bipartisan interest in TikTok and WeChat trying to limit their influence in the U.S. And the both right now there's actually a bill in the House, and there's a little division between the Republicans and Democrats whether TikTok should be banned outright or if the CFIUS, which would basically give the White House more discretion on how to restrict TikTok's influence in the US. And so, but there's a lot of interest in scrutinizing TikTok and its surveillance methods and privacy violations and how it could be used both to, surveil Chinese nationals in the US and potentially also US citizens. So I think there are a lot of things that for Congress to look at here. And probably IP, I think, is in my mind one of the biggest concerns because we've continued to have companies come forward to complain about Chinese companies, or again, to the earlier point, Chinese researchers stealing their IP. And this was something that the Trump trade agreement was supposed to address, but really hasn't done a very good job of.
CFIUS, the acronym you use being short for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's an executive branch committee which reviews foreign investments for national security concerns. House Republicans want to go beyond that and actually some of them ban TikTok. Biden administration has already said that TikTok will have to be out of U.S. government systems within 30 days. So there is even some bipartisan agreement on that, although not to the extent of going as far as banning TikTok. Let's listen to H.R. McMaster. He was one of Donald Trump's national security advisors, also a general who fought in Iraq. He testified at the committee hearing this week. Let's listen.
The balloon, I think, is in many ways, a metaphor for the massive effort at espionage. And I think you can see from the path that the balloon took, and of course, I'm not privy to anything that you are or that our government is at this stage, that it maneuvered over strategic locations. I think when we figure out where previous balloons have gone, that's the same, we'll see the same pattern of trying to get a better look from signals intelligence, communications intelligence, as well as imagery of some of our most sensitive sites. And then when you combine that, though, with the massive buildup of Chinese strategic forces, nuclear forces, I think that's a cause for concern. And then you combine that with Xi Jinping talking about preemptive war. That's an even greater cause for concern.
Joe, the competition with China is probably, well, it's something we haven't faced in decades. And it's very different than the competition we had with the Soviet Union, where there was a complete or near total separation commercially, technologically, between the Soviet Union and the United States and most of the West for that matter. Now, in the case of China, we don't have that separation. What we have is deep, deep ties between the economies of both countries, both as customers and as providers of goods. China obviously has an enormous trade surplus with the United States, but the U.S. sells an enormous amount of goods, including food in particular, to China. So there's a lot of mutual dependence. So the issue of how much to decouple, that's the word du jour, decouple the two U.S. economy from the Chinese economy is a really important one. And I think the committee will have to address that. We're seeing it already emerge in the presidential campaign where Donald Trump has basically come out recently and said we should cut all ties economically to China, which, if done in a rapid fashion, would have enormously damaging economic impact. On the other hand, and you and I have discussed this, I think any prudent American CEO is dependent upon a Chinese supply chain, needs to diversify that pronto in case you end up with some kind of political, diplomatic, military event that drives the politics. So they are forced to find other suppliers, and they better start doing it now.
Yeah, and I think that actually is a good lens to view that clip from General McMaster's that we played a minute ago, because the point I took away from his testimony at that committee is that we have to understand that China is interested in strategic competition or rivalry with us, even if we are not interested in rivalry with them. And so I think that there is this period now where people are kind of waking up to the fact that the Communist Party regime has always understood itself to be in competition with the U.S. and headed towards some kind of reckoning of some sort, whether it was over Taiwan or in some other way. The U.S. has not always understood that that was kind of where they were coming from. And I think that one outgrowth of this committee process might be greater public awareness about that. I view this almost as a public educational exercise to try to make sure that Americans fully understand what the situation is there. And that is going to feed directly into a lot of these business issues because while there's this big political discussion going on about the form that decoupling should take with this suggestion that it ought to be accomplished through various forms of regulation, the reality is that a lot of individual businesses and their CEOs and boards right now need to be or are making decisions about what their future relationship with China is going to be. You know, what is their China supply chain going to be? How much are they going to rely on the China market for revenue growth? That kind of question. And I think from that perspective, for people who are in the situation of having to make that decision about their own business, you know, potentially the kind of information that comes out of hearings like this ends up being very useful.
It is going to be fascinating to watch because the U.S.-China competition is arguably the most significant one in all of world affairs these days, at least over the longer term. Of course, Ukraine and Russia conflict being the most urgent issue of the moment. But even that touches on U.S.-China relations as China debates whether or not to aid Russia militarily in Ukraine. All right, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Alicia. And thank you all for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch. Be sure to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast distributor. Send those cards and letters in, by the way, to pwpodcast at WSJ.com. Thanks so much for listening.